The Orillia Museum of Art and History is located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe. The Anishinaabe include the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations, collectively known as the Three Fires Confederacy. We respect and observe the long and enduring presence of Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit on this land. Their teachings and stewardship, culture, and way of life have shaped our city's unique identity.
Thank you so much for joining us this evening for our final installment of the History Speaker Series for the first part of 2023. We are taking a little summer hiatus after this, so thank you for joining us. And happy National Indigenous Peoples Day as well. So we have a very special presenter with us tonight and a presentation I'm very much looking forward to. But first, I have a few matters of business to attend to before we get going. So firstly, I want to thank Marianne Grant, Trish Progrand, and the OMAH-History Committee for making this presentation possible and this whole series possible, to be honest. Thank you to Deanne, our partner over at Rogers TV, who publishes these on Rogers TV afterwards and makes us look so good and professional. Thank you to McKenna, who is running the Zoom tonight. And thank you to our speaker, of course, as well, who I will get to momentarily. So the order of things tonight, if you've never joined us before, is we will have our presentation, and then that will be followed up by a Q&A. So if you do have any questions, please put them in the Q&A function, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen. And we will pose as many of those as time allows to Mike at the end of the presentation. And now, without further ado, it is my honor to be able to introduce our speaker for the evening. So Mike Hill is joining us today. Mike is a former history teacher, and Mike has also written for a number of newspapers and magazines, including a weekly column for the Toronto Star. Mike's latest book is The Lost Prime Ministers, but we are here to talk about your 2017 book, The Mariposa Folk Festival, A History, which my notes tell me is referred to as the definitive book on the history of the festival. Mike is referred to as the unofficial historian of the Mariposa Folk Festival. And you've been volunteering since 2000, but later the artistic director of the festival beginning in 2006. And what's really interesting is I see that you interviewed Gordon Lightfoot for the book as well. So we can learn a little bit more about Orillia's own Gordon Lightfoot through reading your story. With the festival coming up so soon in the year, I think it's very fitting that you end off our spring season of the History Speaker Series. So Mike, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to all of you in the audience for joining us. And that's it for me for now. Mike, take it away.
I want to start off by saying that, Orillia has a really rich cultural history. There's, I've got a picture of just four important parts of that. Gordon Lightfoot, of course, who I think many of us consider him the greatest songwriter in Canadian history. Franklin Carmichael is considered by a lot of art experts as one of the greatest, if not the greatest, watercolor painter in Canadian history, and the youngest member of the group of seven. And then Arthur Schilling, local Rama boy. He's probably considered one of the greatest Indigenous artists in Canadian history, and died tragically too young, of course. But some of his work hangs with the group of seven down at Kleinburg. And then there's Stephen Leacock, of course, who, his legacy is his humor, Sunshine Sketches. He called Orillia Mariposa, and, we know where that name has gone. And his memory is still being kept alive at the museum, and also with the annual Medal for Humor. So there's another factor there too. The something else that Orillia is known for, and this is something probably people in Orillia don't even realize, but the Mariposa Folk Festival is known coast to coast and internationally, and it started in Orillia as well. And it apparently was a dark and stormy night. Back in 1961, there was a man named John Fraser who was he was a radio personality known as Mr. Canada. And he was going around to small towns all across the country and trying to tell people in the towns how to encourage tourism. And he used the Shakespeare Festival in Stratford as his example, of course. And Ruth Jones was in the audience that night, and she was a real folk music fan. And folk music, this would be hard for young people to believe, but folk music was arguably the most popular music at the time. Bob Dylan was starting out, Joan Baez, Peter, Paul, and Mary, very, very popular. And there was one folk festival in North America, and that was down at Newport, Rhode Island. And Ruth thought, well, maybe we could do that in Canada, and more specifically in Orillia. I've included a picture here on the right of the PAV, and people in Orillia of a certain age remember the PAV, and that's where the meeting was actually, where this idea was first originated. Ruth quickly got her husband involved. His name is Dr. Casey Jones, and he put up the money. Ruth did the organizing and most of the legwork, but she brought in people like Pete McGarvey. Pete was an alderman at the time and a broadcaster at local radio station CFOR. And then they eventually got several other people, Sid Dolgay from the Travelers, David Major, who was Ruth's brother, Ian Tyson, who was just becoming famous as a singer, and several other people that you may have run across at other times. In the space of 7 months, in early 1961, Ruth and her gang, they were able to pull together a festival, and it was quite an accomplishment, to start from scratch and to have it actually come about as it did. Ian Tyson designed that first program. It's right there. And the poster apparently hung in his kitchen until he died fairly recently, just this past year. He was very proud of his early connection with Mariposa. The performers, some of the performers were just hired, others had to audition. And two local guys, Orillia, Gordon Lightfoot and his partner Terry Whalen, they were playing as a duo at the time, and they auditioned, but they were turned down, if you can believe that. And Gordon told me that he said, we sounded too much like the Everly Brothers. And they took that as a backhanded compliment because it meant that they were very good at harmonies, for one thing. And but they had to wait their turn to appear at the festival. This is a picture from the very first festival. There was a street dance on the Friday night, and that's a picture near the corner of Mississauga Street and Peter Street in Orillia, and it was all very peaceful, very calm, and no outrageous behavior, which changed in a couple of years' time, as you will see. The star attractions at the first festival were Ian and Sylvia. They, along with the Travelers, were the best known acts on the list. And but every act was treated the same. Nobody was really called a headliner. No one was considered a star. Everybody was paid exactly the same amount, which I've seen the contracts, and it was not a lot of money that they made for playing at the festival. The stage is kind of interesting. Dr. Jones had a fascination for medieval pageantry, and he actually designed that first stage, did a little mock-up model of it. And then you can see on the right, that's the actual stage. And the first festival was held at the community center where the Lions Oval School is now. And then there's a picture of Ian and Sylvia standing in front of that stage as well. The second year, the lineup was almost exactly the same. They brought back the same people. They did include Oscar Brand, who was a TV star at the time. He had a TV show called Let's Sing Out. And then they added this guy as well. He finally got to play in 1962. Gordon, by that time, had split up with Terry, and he was on his own and just starting out. And it wasn't his first time. It was his first time to play the festival, but it certainly wasn't his last. So we get to 1963. Orillia at that time had about 15,000 people. It was a really peaceful little town. Apparently, there was a police force of about 15 local town policemen, about 10 OPP, and 4 RCMP. Those were the numbers that I was able to find anyway. So they were not prepared for what happened in August of that year when the festival came back to town. The first year, the festival brought in about 2,000 people. The second year, in 62, there were about 5,000, which was a pretty big crowd. And then by the time you got to 1963, it's estimated that there were about 20,000 people came to Orillia for the folk festival. Well, some came for the festival, some came for the party. Apparently, the highway coming north from Toronto was jammed. On the Friday night, the restaurants and grocery stores sold out, and but everything was peaceful. There was a campground for a lot of the visitors at Severn Bridge, which is 10, 12 miles north of Orillia, and they had planned to have some kind of partying there, but that got out of hand out there, and with it could only accommodate a certain amount of people, so lots of the visitors just threw up their tents in Couchiching Beach Park. And I'm sure a lot used Tudhope Park too, which at that time was called Barnfield Campground. Saturday night, the concert was jam-packed at the Oval, like right to the fences apparently, and not even all the people could get in. Some of the people who had even bought tickets couldn't get in. And what happened was after the concerts were over at 10, 11 o'clock at night, the crowd decided to head downtown, very short distance. They walked down, and there were all kinds of stories about what happened. Some of them I think are apocryphal, some are kind of made up, some have been enhanced or misremembered. But the police obviously just could not handle the crowds. Orillia at the time was a dry town. You were not very restricted where you could buy or sell or drink alcohol, and people were walking around with open beer cases, handing out beer out of the backs of their cars and so on. And police were arresting people, taking them to the police station, which is the Orillia Museum of Art and History now, taking them down to the basement. There were 3 little cells down there, and apparently they would put people in for a few minutes and then rotate them out and put the next few people in. There were stories of, the police being surrounded by crowds when they tried to stop people from drinking or carrying cases of beer around. The crowd would swarm around the cops, and the police were just powerless. There were stories about, rolling beer bottles down the Mississauga Street Hill towards the lake. I can't really imagine that that's true since, if there were so many people on the streets, but apparently all kinds of broken glass on the side streets like Matchadash, for example. A lot of the storefronts, in Orillia, a lot of the storefronts are recessed. They were used as toilets, likewise with people's houses along the way. And then the crowd moved to Couchiching Beach Park. The statue of Samuel de Champlain was baptized with beer. There were stories of thefts from cars and from buses at the at the park. One thing that's interesting about all this is there were a lot of arrests and a lot of charges, but not one person from Orillia was charged with any kind of misdemeanor or crime. Just a little bit of a personal, I have a couple of times where I'm going to switch over to personal anecdotes. I was very, very young at the time, but the day after the festival, I went down to the park with my cousin, and we gathered, and I've worked this out mathematically, 2,000 beer bottles, because we made $40. And I remember my dad coming around with the car. We would pick up boxes and boxes of beer bottles, and he would take them to the beer store and then come back and we'd load up the car again. So that kind of tells you how much drinking was going on. This is a quote from Alderman Pete McGarvey, not festival organizer Pete McGarvey. He said, "It's obvious that we can't have another festival here." And it was nationwide news that really it had this so-called riot at the festival. It didn't deter the organizers, though, because the next year they planned another festival, again, beginning of August. And this time it was going to be out near Moonstone. And the people at Moonstone were not too happy about it. The council there got went to court to stop the organizers from setting up. And it wasn't settled until the actual day before the festival was supposed to start. So August 6th, the organizers got word, sorry, you can't set up your festival here at Moonstone. So really quickly, and this just amazes me as being part of being one of the people who helped organize the festival when it came back to Orillia, they were able to transfer all their equipment, all the performers, work out accommodations and everything down to Toronto. What they did was they rented Maple Leaf Stadium, which was the baseball stadium for the AAA Maple Leafs, down at the foot of Bathurst Street. And that's where they held the festival in 1964. Buffy St. Marie was the big name that year, but Gordon Lightfoot got to play again. And this is a picture from 1964 of Gordon on stage with blues legends, Reverend Gary Davis and Mississippi John Hurt. Gordon told me he was very nervous and very very thrilled at the same time to be playing with such musical legends. A lady named Estelle Klein took over the programming in 1965, and Estelle is very well known in the folk music business, festival business. She's the person who instigated having mini concerts during the day, called workshops. And just about every folk festival, at least, and a lot of other festivals too, have these kinds of workshops now. What she would do is take several performers who maybe they didn't even play the same type of music, but she would put them together under some kind of theme, and they would all chip in and try to play along with each other. And it's been a very successful thing. I know for a lot of the people who still go to the festival, it's more interesting for them than the actual main stage shows. So that's one of the things about Estelle Klein was she started that. She's very, very influential in the history of Mariposa. In 1965, Mariposa moved northwest of Toronto to a place called, Caledon, but a place called Innes Lake. But don't go looking for Innes Lake on a map at all. The Innes Lake it was the Innes family farm, and they had a little pond on it, so they colorfully called it Innes Lake. I like this picture because it sort of reminds me of the pictures that we've all seen of Woodstock a few years later in 1969. But it stayed there for several years. In 1965, an interesting thing happened, and this is my favorite picture of all the photos that I've gone through of thousands of photos of Mariposa. On the Saturday night, the power went out. And the Mariposa organizers, as usual, being very good at impromptu things, turned several cars towards the stage, turned their lights on, and then someone stood beside the performer, in this case, Phil Oakes, and Phil sang into the megaphone and finished the concert. Just kind of shows you, we've had similar things happen later on with rain and rainstorms. So like I said, for 3 years, it played at Innes Lake. And again, if you're of a certain age and you know folk music, if you look at some of those names, it's, these were big stars who stayed big stars for many, many years. Leonard Cohen and Joni Mitchell both played the festival at that time. When I was talking to Gordon Lightfoot a few years ago, I said to him, Gordon, you are our greatest singer and songwriter. He said, oh, no. You'd have to talk to Leonard and Joni about that. But that's up for debate. Like I said, Ian Tyson designed the first Mariposa logo. Murray McLaughlin, who at that time was just a volunteer, he changed it in 1967, and it's still the same logo that Mariposa uses to this day. In 1968, the festival moved to Toronto Island. It was closer to the big city and where most of the audience came from. It was a controlled access because you could only get there by ferry. And it allowed the organizers to, they could close off the island, and it was a beautiful natural setting. It was very much like what Tutta Park is to this day. Treed, lots of room to spread out so that there wasn't sound bleed from one minor stage to the next. And it's really where Mariposa made its big reputation. In 1969, Joan Baez was the headliner, and she that was a year that the CBC actually did a documentary about Mariposa, but it's very, very difficult to find. I was not able to find a copy of it when I was doing all my research for Mariposa for my book, and I have found a copy since with CBC, but it's a very rare thing. Very few people have seen it. Joni Mitchell loved the festival, and she said it was the place to be. So she convinced her then briefly boyfriend, James Taylor, who was just starting out as a big star. James was making, well, let's say tens of thousands a night. She convinced him to come to Mariposa and play in 1970, and his contract was for $200 for the weekend. But that was kind of the influence that Estelle Klein, that Joni Mitchell had, and also the reputation that the festival was getting. Estelle was, she was also very instrumental in diversifying the festival. She brought in acts from Africa, from Europe. She made sure that there was a strong Indigenous presence, and we can credit her for doing a lot of that kind of multicultural stuff as well. In 1972, I tell the story that we got visits from folk royalty. I was there that year. Again, still very, very young. But I went to see Murray McLaughlin, who I was a big fan of Murray. And he got up, this was Saturday afternoon, and he said, well, sorry, folks, I'm not going to be playing this afternoon. And there was a groan from the crowd because, we were all there to see Murray. He says, my friend Joni Mitchell is here from Los Angeles. So Joni got up and she sang about 5 or 6 songs. And then she said, well, that's it for me. And again, everyone groaned. And she said, my friend Jackson Browne is here from Los Angeles. So Jackson Browne got up and sang. So it was, we had some interesting visitors. Then the next day, Bruce Cockburn was slated for a concert about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And he stood up and said, I'm giving up my concert today because Neil Young has dropped in. And Neil was just starting out as a solo artist at that time. And again, it was a thrill for the audience. Bob Dylan showed up that weekend. he came to see a guy named Leon Redbone, who was a quirky, old-time, mysterious figure. You couldn't really count on when you were going to see or hear Leon. So when Bob found he was going to be at Mariposa, he decided to fly all the way from New York to Toronto, and he showed up, and Gordon Lightfoot showed up as well, just dropping in to check out everything. I don't think it was planned that the two of them were going to be there together, but they did get together. Gordon wandered around the site unannounced, and at one point he gave an impromptu concert on a picnic table with the Good Brothers. So a few lucky people got to hear Gord with the Good Brothers unplugged. Many years on the island were sellouts, and the festival really flourished. They really had made a lot of money. They were able to hire staff. They had an office in downtown Toronto, and it was good times for them. They started to put out records on vinyl of the artists, and they also started to tape every performance. So you might have a performance where John Prine, for example, would be playing with Steve Goodman and Bonnie Raitt, and something that would never ever be repeated again. We have it on recording in the Mariposa archives, thanks to the foresight of people to tape those workshops and concerts. A few years, it rained. And the rain washed things out. Ticket sales suffered, and the finances of the organization suffered as well. So it was up and down, which has been the history of the festival. There was an actual Native peoples area, like an entire part of one of the islands down the Toronto Island complex there. It was set up in the mid-70s. It had a teepee, and you could go there to look at the indigenous crafts, music, storytelling, and again, kind of showing, acceptance, maybe ahead of its time, I think. But folkies tend to be that way. Mariposa to this day has an area called Folk Play, which is a children's area. Well, it was really pioneered by Sharon Troston and Lois Lillenstein, 2/3 of Sharon, Lois, and Bram. And Bram, for that matter, he had been a performer back in the 60s at Mariposa when it was at Innes Lake. So the three of them had a long history, and they were inducted into the Mariposa Hall of Fame a few years ago, rightly so. By about 1980, though, the festival, they weren't selling as many tickets. It was scaled down. In fact, it was so scaled down in 1980 that it was just a fall festival, and they held it at Harborfront inside. And I consider it, it's a really unknown why that happened, why it went from being so popular to, really almost dwindling away to nothing. I think part of it was changing musical tastes. Younger people wanted disco and punk music. There was more competition for the entertainment dollar, that's for sure. A lot more bars and live venues and things like the Blue Jays had been established by then. I'm not really sure. I don't really have an answer for that. My friends out in the West who were setting up folk festivals at that time, they say that it wasn't either any one of those things, because they were starting the Calgary Folk Festival and the Edmonton and Winnipeg Folk Festivals at that time. So I'm not really sure the answer. But what it meant for Mariposa was that they were headed towards bankruptcy. There had been some financial mismanagement. They had to fire people who were working for them just because there wasn't money to pay them. Bad weather certainly hurt it. So that in 1981 and 1983, there were no festivals at all. And the one in 82 just was not very successable and didn't bring in enough money. And the festival had worked up a huge deficit. They owed a lot of money. And there was even a movement to cancel the foundation. Estelle Klein actually was part of that group that wanted to just cancel Mariposa and say, we had our day, let's end it. Thankfully, they didn't. Because, I like to say, Mariposa was saved by the beer. The Molsons had set up a brewery in Barrie, right just off of Highway 400, and they had a huge park just to the south of it. It's all big box stores now, but at that time it was a beautiful park, which had enough room for camping and for all the things that we've come to know at Mariposa. They needed Mariposa needed some support. But Molson's also wanted to have some kind of event that would bring in people to rent their facility and, most importantly, to drink their beer. So they actually offered to sponsor Mariposa for 5 years, and it was quite successful there. Tracy Chapman, Lyle Lovett, Lorena McKennett, they played there. Arlo Guthrie, Joan Baez again, Jackson Brown again. So we had quite a few big name people come to Mariposa at Barrie. That's a picture of the folk play at Barrie. Then in 1990, it was a terrible weekend for the festival. It rained all weekend and I guess the week leading up to it. And I heard one story, and I'm not sure if this is actually true, but one of the people who volunteered at the time told me that they did not sell a single ticket at the gate because of the rain. And at the same time, Molson's was deciding to go in a different direction. They wanted more say. They wanted to hire groups. Well, one story is that they wanted to hire a group called they wanted to hire the Moody Blues. And they said they would pay for everything, but it didn't really fit in with the Mariposa folky vibe. There was a film shot that year, and you can actually watch it on YouTube. And it tells a bit of a story of the festival, but it also shows, what it was like and what a terrible weekend it was weather-wise. So Mariposa had to be on the move again. In the early 90s, it moved back to Toronto, this time to Ontario Place in September. So, after the CNE was over and most of the tourists had gone home, Ontario Place was pretty much vacant. So they were able to use the facilities there. And I was never there myself personally, but I heard that it was a great venue. Again, they could spread out. There wasn't any noise if you're at one stage and you didn't hear what was going on at the stage nearby. Some of the posters from the early 90s. The Bare Naked Ladies were just starting out when they played Mariposa for the first time. Apparently, they didn't even have a record deal at the time. They just had cassettes, and they came back a few years later, and they were thrilled, and they remembered being there so many years before. One year at the festival, they held it in June, and talk about having bad luck. It actually snowed that weekend. It was so cold, one of the few times that it ever snowed in Toronto in June. And unfortunately, it happened the weekend of Mariposa. In the mid-90s, one year, 1996, they actually held two festivals, one in Cobourg, one in Bracebridge. The one in Cobourg, it was kind of mismanaged. They gave away too many free tickets. And also, that very weekend, there used to be a ferry that ran from Rochester, New York, across the lake to Cobourg. And there was a big drug bust on the ferry that year. And the people in Cobourg, I guess some of the city councilors, were just shocked, and they didn't want anything to do with these hippies and bringing their drugs into Cobourg. So it was canceled in Cobourg. Bracebridge, they kept it going for about 3 years up there. And they had a beautiful site there, the Annie Williams Park, nice sloping area, goes down to the lake. But the money wasn't really there for the festival to hire big name acts that would draw crowds. So by 1999, It was back to Toronto, but this time in Parkdale, which is in the western part of downtown Toronto. And it was just a few afternoon concerts and not a very big festival at all. So Mariposa was, on one of those very bottoming out spaces in its existence. So they were looking to go elsewhere or to find some way to keep the festival alive or revive it. And thankfully, we had these three guys. I call them the three wise guys. Tim Lauer and Don Evans were both counselors in Orillia. And Gord Ball was a musician and a folkie. And the three of them had started to lobby Mariposa about coming back to Orillia. And again, it was one of those things where, Mariposa needed a place to go. Orillia wanted to have them back. And it worked. The festival finally came back in 2000, thanks to these three guys and a lot of other people too, of course. So against all odds, Mariposa came back to Orillia in 2000. People had long memories. There were a few people that thought, oh no, we don't want these rioters coming back to Orillia. They remembered the 1963 events, but that was a very small voice at the time. The fact that Gordon Lightfoot was the Sunday night headliner assured success. And Mariposa was back on the upward trend again. The money started to come in, and they were able to spend a little more freely for a couple of years, and then they spent so freely that they almost went bankrupt again. I shouldn't say went bankrupt. They just went a little wild with the money and weren't as careful as they should have been, some of the organizers. During that time, Steve Earle, Bruce Coburn, Ian Tyson, David Francie, Gord Downey on it with his own solo act, Murray McLaughlin, they were some of the male performers. The McGarrigle sisters, Serena Ryder got her start at Mariposa, Natalie McMaster and Feist. So some fairly big names came in, and the festival started to get a reputation as being, a good place to have fun. It didn't really matter what kind of music you liked. You were going to see and hear all kinds of things. Then in 2004, there was a little bit of drama. A lot of people listening to this might remember that Gordon nearly died in 2002 from an aneurysm that he had. And for a couple of years, it didn't look like he would ever perform again. I remember thinking that we'll never get to hear him again. But then at the festival in 2004, all of a sudden this black limousine pulls in. Out steps Gordon. His chauffeur pulls the guitar out of the back, and he asked if he could get up on stage. And he sang one song, which was appropriately called I'll Tag Along. I was in the audience, and probably a lot of your listeners, you listeners are as well. You could hear a pin drop, and it was such an emotional moment for people. In 2005, the festival decided to honor people who had helped out, either as volunteers or as entertainers. And the first people that were honored were the builders, Pete McGarvey and Ruth and so on. And then the next year we honored Ian and Sylvia and actually got them back together. So that was quite an event. It was held down at Hughes Room in Toronto. So it was very small. You can only get about 200 people in that venue, but Gordon Lightfoot got up and gave an eloquent speech about how great Ian and Sylvia were. And we got testimonials from, I got people like, Leonard Cohen and Nancy Griffith and Tom Russell all sent words of congratulations. It was very nice event. The archives, like I said, they've been saving all of the tapes of the concerts and the workshops. Mariposa had all these fabulous pictures from festivals past, and it was all being held in an old police station in Parkdale. And I was on the board of directors at the time. We went down to Parkdale to look at the archives with an archivist from the Ontario government. And she noted that there was a rusting sewer pipe directly above all of this stuff. And the archival material was not being stored properly. In a lot of the cans of like a lot of the recordings were on tape, reel tape, and the tape was actually turning to water in the cans. So she said, this stuff is worth millions of dollars, but you need to get it to an archive, a proper facility to look after it. So we quickly made arrangements to take it to the York University Clara Thomas archives in Toronto. Bob Dylan, we think he showed up again, and there's kind of a mysterious story about that. Gordon Lightfoot and Dylan were both scheduled to play in Orillia that weekend, believe it or not. Dylan was out at the Casino Rama. Lightfoot was on main stage, and I was the musical director at that time, the artistic director, and I phoned Bob Dylan's agent to say, Bob and Gordon are good friends. They're both playing there. They'd probably like to see each other, and so I invited Dylan to come to the festival, so that was the weekend, though, that on the Sunday night, just as Gordon was getting up on stage, the skies opened up. We had a terrible rain and thunder and lightning storm, and Gordon stayed up on the stage, even though everyone was yelling at him to get off. You're going to get electrocuted. He stayed on, and I think the reason he was staying on because he probably thought that Bob was going to show up. At that time at Tuttup Park, there was only one exit. And when the rain began, a lot of people decided, well, I guess I've had enough of the festival. I'm going to head out. So there's quite a crowd leaving the festival. At the same time, this long white limousine from the direction of Rama pulled in. I guess they looked at all the cars leaving the park, and they thought that the show was over. And they turned around and left, and again went back towards in the direction of Rama. So we think that Bob Dylan showed up. It would have been a great story if he had shown up and played with Gordon, or at least maybe came up on stage or something. I should mention about 1972, going back to 1972, the first time Dylan was there, he actually asked to play at Mariposa that year, but the organizers denied him. They said, well, we're afraid that people will come running from every other part of the island, and we just won't be able to control the crowds, and who knows what could happen. So twice Dylan showed up, and twice he didn't get to play. Now, we've always been hiring local acts at Mariposa. So there are some of the ones: Ronnie Douglas, Steph Dunn, Alex the Folk Band, the Fernwood Trio, Run with the Kittens, Lance Anderson, and there are a few others. I haven't mentioned them all there, but those are the ones I had pictures for. In 2010, it was the 50th anniversary. Ruth came back. So that was sort of the then and now pictures of Ruth. Ian and Sylvia both showed up. They got together to sing one song at the end, Four Strong Winds. And Sheila Rogers, was the main stage host that year. Sheila has a radio show on CBC. When they started to sing Four Strong Winds, I looked at Sheila, and the tears were just running down her face. And I'm sure that was true of a lot of people in the audience as well. Gordon showed up, of course. Murray McLaughlin. Oscar Brand. Oscar was 90 years old, but still, still sharp as a tack, and very nice man. Brought with him another folk legend. The man sitting there beside him is Josh White Jr. And The Whiteley brothers, Ken and Chris, had played Mariposa. They'd been at Mariposa since 1967 and came back. Orillia had, by 2010, Orillia had really embraced Mariposa. The Streets Alive festival that we've had every year for the last, I don't know how many years, really seemed to quite often pick Mariposa as the theme. And the year of 2010, it was the big guitars. And other years it's been the hippie vans, and it doesn't seem to matter what it is. The artists in town will quite often pick Mariposa. We have an unexpected visitor every year nearly. Unfortunately, that's not going to happen anymore, but Gordon would often show up to sing one or two songs at the end, and it was always a thrill for the audience. It almost came to be an expected thing the last few years. I always used to have a Gordon Lightfoot workshop where I'd have different performers playing Lightfoot songs, and quite often Gordon would come and listen in, and a few times he actually got up on stage and sang something as well. Recently, we've had Jan Arden, Serena Ryder, Peter Yarrow, Arlo Guthrie, the Barenica Ladies. These are just some of the performers in the last few years. Blue Rodeo were a big hit last year, of course. Buffy St. Marie's been there a couple of times in the last couple of decades. She's still going strong. That's a picture of a workshop stage, in case you're not familiar with Mariposa and its format. You can get, well, you used to be able to get up and close. The bigger the crowds get at the festival, the harder it is to see the performers up close. As you can see, the crowds have got massive. We have huge video screens at the sides and in the middle. So it doesn't matter where you sit, you get a great view of the show, and you can see the enthusiasm in the crowd there. One thing that's notable is that the pictures that you saw from 1970 or so, they were very, the crowd was very young, in their 20s, maybe a few in their 30s. When it first came back to Orillia, it was people who were kind of gray-haired or even blue-haired in the audiences. But I think that's really changed in the last few years. It's got to be a younger crowd again, and that's good. That means that folk music is still popular, and still popular with a younger demographic as well. That's a map of the festival showing the dark green areas, the camping. Camping has been a big boon to the festival as far as bringing in a crowd that stays there all weekend. I kind of equate it's like Brigadoon. The festival, the Tutta Park is clean, well-kept little park in town. Then for a week, it undergoes a change. This little village pops up, and then within two days, it's gone again. When I was part of the organizing crew for the festival, we used to have a walk around with city officials to check out the park to see if there was anything that needed to be changed or anything that needed to be watched for safety, and then they do another walk about 2 or 3 days after the festival. And after the festival, the city officials would often say to us, "You leave the park better than you found it." So that's a credit to Mariposa and the organizers. There's what it looks like if you're up on stage, singing to the beer crowd, the beer tent. The food at Mariposa is always good. There's great variety, lineups for the food, and great testimonials from people when we ask for surveys at the end of the festival. The food is always a hit. There's an artisan village where you can buy, all kinds of crafts, anything from guitars to guitar picks and things that are not necessarily musical, baskets and drums and so on. There's a view from the water showing Westphalia Lane, where all the Volkswagen camper vans park, and it's a very peaceful, beautiful setting. And again, the people who come, they're peaceful. That they're here for a good time, but they don't destroy anything. They don't cause any damage, and they bring in. It's considered to be millions of dollars worth of value to the city of Orillia every summer. Those are just some more of the acts that people might be familiar with: Dave Gunning, Dalla, Matt Anderson, and that's my history of Mariposa.
So from Nancy, did Anne Murray ever perform?
No. And by the time, at least, I mean, I'm not sure whether any artistic director before me tried to get her or not. She would have been a great fit. And she was a fantastic performer. I remember seeing her at Casino Rama, and she was just very down to earth, and she would have fitted in with the Mariposa vibe perfectly. But no, she never ever did play at Mariposa.
Similar question: did Rita McNeil ever perform at Mariposa?
Yes, I believe so. I think in the 80s she played at Mariposa. I would have to look that up. I'm sorry. I do have a list of all the performers, and I wanted to include it in my book, but the author or the publisher decided that was too many pages to put in. But Rita McNeil, what a great songwriter. In Sydney, Nova Scotia, they love her the way we love Gordon Lightfoot in Orillia. And Rita would be, again, same kind of down-to-earth person. She'd have fit the vibe perfectly.
A question here from Jane: is the foundation profitable now? Yes.
The Mariposa is back on good financial grounds. They had the foresight a few years ago. Well, I know Ted Duncan, who's involved with OMA. Ted was the president of Mariposa for a while, and Ted and a few other people were saying, you've got to start saving some money for a rainy day, and set up some kind of rainy day fund. And the board of directors over the years has been able to put money aside, and now they're very secure. And now, the festival is back to the stage where it's selling out again every year. Like this year, it sold out really early, which is fantastic for the festival, money-wise.
Yeah.
Disappointing for a few people who didn't get their tickets in time.
Yeah. Question from Jerry and Bob: did Stan or Garnet Rogers ever perform?
Yes. Stan Rogers, and with Garnet backing him, played many times in the 1970s and even into the 80s before he died in about 1982, 83. Yes, he played quite often. And then Garnet has played the festival several times. I remember I hired him maybe about 2011 or so to play the festival. Garnet never wanted to play any Stan songs, though. He always made that he made a point of saying, I do my own songs. And but he would play if it was a Stan Rogers tribute or a Stan Rogers themed workshop. He would participate in those things.
Very cool question here. Can you think of a quote unquote unknown artist that you took a chance on and they exceeded your expectations?
Yes, Matt Anderson for one. Matt Anderson, I went to, like when you're an artistic director, you travel to different conferences and concerts and things like that. And I went to Ottawa to a folk music conference, and it was about 1 o'clock in the morning. I was just about the only person in the room. And Matt Anderson got up on stage and just blew me away with what a good guitarist he was. And Matt is predominantly a blues performer, and I'm not a blues fan in particular, but I just knew that this guy would, he was going to be great. People would love him, and people would, like, and that he was headed for bigger and better things, and he certainly has proven that. Another group was the Good Lovelies. They had just graduated from university, and they went to the Folk Music Ontario conference in London. And what all the performers used to do was they would put their CDs into a big box, one for Mariposa Folk Festival, one for Summer Folk, one for the Ottawa Folk Festival. And I would listen to them on my way home. And I didn't even catch these girls at, live in London. But when I listened to their CD, I couldn't believe how good they were and how amazing they were. So I hired them, sight unseen, basically, just based on their CD, which is not a good thing for an artistic director to do, but it worked out, and they have proven me to be correct. There are several stories I could tell like that.
I bet. Will you be attending Mariposa this year, Mike?
I hope so.
Okay, last question. Who is the act you are most excited to see this year?
Well, I'm old school folky, so I think Judy Collins would be. I've never seen Judy Collins live in concert, so she'll be the one that I'd be looking forward to see the most, I think.
Very cool. Well, folks, you can look for Mike at Mariposa and say hello and tell him how much you've enjoyed your presentation this evening.